My name is Mary Collins. I'm in my late 30s, a wife, a professional, and, at least on the surface, someone most people would describe as easy to get along with. I've been called calm, dependable, and low maintenance, the kind of woman who doesn't make scenes, who smooths things over, who listens more than she speaks. For a long time, I believed those were strengths. I still do. But I've learned they can also become the reason people feel comfortable crossing lines they would never cross with someone louder. People tend to underestimate me. They assume that because I don't raise my voice, I don't notice tone. Because I pause before responding, I must not have anything sharp to say. Because I value harmony, I must fear conflict. What they miss is that quiet doesn't mean unaware. Impatience doesn't mean permission. This story is about a moment many of you will recognize, even if the details differ. It's about family, holidays, and the strange way disrespect can wear the mask of just joking. It's about the night my life subtly changed, the night my husband let his sister insult me during Thanksgiving dinner. He never said a word. I want to be clear about what this story is not. It's not a tale of explosive confrontation. There's no screaming match, no dramatic walkout, no perfectly timed clapback that leaves everyone stunned. There's no revenge fantasy here. What unfolded was quieter than that, slower, and far more honest. This is a story about emotional justice, the kind that doesn't announce itself, about psychological reversal that happens not through force, but through clarity, about what occurs when someone stops explaining their pain and starts respecting it instead. Over the next chapters, I'll walk you through how I was seen within my husband's family, how small comments were dismissed as harmless, and how silence, mine and his, slowly redefined the power dynamics in the room. You'll hear about the internal shift that no one noticed at first, the preparation that happened out of sight, and the consequences that arrived without shouting or blame. Some of you may expect anger, others may expect vindication. What I can promise instead is honesty. I'll tell you where I doubted myself, where I stayed quiet longer than I should have, and where I chose restraint not because I was weak, but because I was precise. If you've ever sat at a table smiling politely while feeling diminished, if you've ever been told you were too sensitive for noticing disrespect, if you've ever waited for someone to defend you and realized they wouldn't, then this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. I'm not sharing this to prove anything or to paint anyone as a villain. I'm sharing it because quiet moments often teach the loudest lessons, and because sometimes the most powerful shift happens when no one is watching. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever sensed that a single moment of silence changed how you saw an entire relationship? To my husband's family, I was easy to define because I made it easy for them. I was Mark's wife, the polite one, the reasonable one, the woman who brought thoughtful hostess gifts and remembered birthdays without needing reminders, the one who helped clear plates before anyone asked, the one who smiled when conversations drifted past her, not because she agreed, but because she didn't want to interrupt the flow. At family gatherings, I occupied a very specific space, not central, not invisible, but adjacent, useful, pleasant, non-disruptive. I was someone you could rely on without needing to acknowledge too closely. And for a long time, I didn't question that role. Mark's family was close in a way that looked warm from the outside. Loud laughter, inside jokes, shared history that wrapped around the table like a second tablecloth. I married into years of stories I hadn't lived, references I didn't always catch, and dynamics already set in place. I told myself that was normal. Healthy, even. His sister Claire was the center of gravity in that system. Charismatic, sharp-tongued, effortlessly confident, she spoke quickly and decisively, as if the room belonged to her thoughts before anyone else could finish theirs. People adjusted around her without realizing they were doing it, including me. When Claire talked, others listened. When she joked, laughter followed. When she teased, it was labeled just how she is. I noticed early on that her humor often needed a target. Sometimes it was Mark, sometimes their parents, and occasionally, subtly, it was me, but never in a way that caused the room to stop. That's the important part. Nothing she said was overt enough to demand intervention. Nothing crossed a line so boldly that someone had to step in. It lived in tone, in timing, in the way a comment landed and was immediately smoothed over by laughter or distraction. And because it wasn't obvious, it became invisible. I was described as easygoing, which in their language meant I didn't react, I didn't correct, I didn't push back. That interpretation slowly hardened into expectation. The version of me they thought they knew was someone who would always absorb discomfort quietly and move on. At dinners, I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, I chose my words carefully, not out of fear, but out of habit. I valued peace. I believed respect would follow consistency and kindness. What I didn't realize then was that silence, when repeated, begins to sound like consent. Mark never discouraged my quiet nature. In fact, I think he appreciated it. Compared to the intensity of his family, my calm felt like relief. I was his place to rest, his contrast. But contrast can also become camouflage. To him, I was steady. To them, I was flexible. And somewhere between those two perceptions, I began to disappear. Not entirely, but just enough. No one asked what I thought about family decisions. No one noticed when conversation shifted over my sentences. If Claire interrupted me, it was seamless, practiced. If I stopped mid-thought, no one circled back. And still I told myself this was minor. I wasn't unhappy. That's important to say. I didn't feel abused or trapped. I felt diminished in small, cumulative ways, like a voice gradually turned down, not muted, just lowered enough to stop being distinct. I believed that being gracious meant not needing acknowledgement, that maturity meant choosing which battles weren't worth fighting. I believed that love, especially in families, required tolerance. What I didn't understand yet was that tolerance without boundaries doesn't create harmony. It creates hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, I had been placed carefully, quietly, below the threshold of consideration, but above the level where anyone felt guilty about it. That was who I was to them. Not someone to challenge, not someone to protect, not someone to fear losing, just someone who would always be there, smiling, making space. And for a while, I accepted that. I can still remember the first moment clearly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet enough to slip past everyone else. It happened at a Sunday dinner, months before that Thanksgiving. The kind of gathering that blended into all the others. Comfortable, familiar, safe on the surface. Claire was talking about her work, fast, animated, confident. She had a way of telling stories where she was always the most competent person in the room, and everyone else existed as supporting characters. I listened, nodded, and asked a polite follow-up question when there was space. At some point, the conversation shifted toward me. "So, Mary," she said, smiling in that casual, almost affectionate way, "you're still doing that consulting thing, right?" That word thing was small, almost nothing. "Yes," I replied. "I've actually just taken on a new—" She cut in smoothly, without apology. "I mean, it must be nice to have something flexible, not too stressful." She laughed lightly, the way people do when they expect agreement. A few others smiled. Someone reached for more wine. The room didn't go quiet. No one stiffened. No one looked at me to check how it landed. I felt it, though. A small internal flinch. Not pain exactly, more like disorientation. As if something had been nudged out of place, just slightly. I finished my sentence anyway, softer than I'd started. No one responded to it. Mark was sitting beside me. He was looking at his plate, then at his sister, then back at the table. His expression didn't change. He didn't say anything. At the time, I told myself I was imagining it, that Claire hadn't meant anything by it, that she was just speaking offhandedly, that it wasn't worth correcting, especially in front of everyone. And so I smiled. I even nodded, as if she'd said something kind. That was the first cut, not because of what she said, but because of what followed. Or rather, what didn't. No one clarified, no one redirected, no one acknowledged my work as real, demanding, or meaningful. And most importantly, no one defended the version of me that existed outside that room, especially not my husband. It would have taken so little. A simple, actually, Mary's work is pretty intense. Or even, she's being modest. Something casual, something light, something that signaled I mattered enough to be accurately represented. But Mark stayed silent. Later that night, I almost mentioned it. The words hovered at the back of my throat while we brushed our teeth, while we got into bed. I rehearsed how I'd say it without sounding sensitive or accusatory. In the end, I didn't. I told myself I didn't need validation from his family. I told myself Mark loved and respected me. That was enough. I told myself one comment didn't define anything. And yet, something had shifted. Not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, I began to pay closer attention. I noticed how easily Claire spoke over me, how often she reframed my words into something smaller, how the room followed her lead without question. And I noticed how Mark, unintentionally or not, let it happen. The first small cut didn't bleed, it didn't scar, it didn't demand immediate care, but it marked a place where silence was chosen, a place where meaning was minimized, a place that would be returned to again and again. And once you felt that kind of cut, even the smallest one, you don't forget where it came from. After that first moment, nothing changed, and that was the problem. The comments didn't escalate. They didn't become cruel or obvious. They simply continued, scattered across conversations like small pebbles you step on so often you stop reacting to the pressure. Claire developed a rhythm with me. If I spoke about work, she reframed it as nice and flexible. If I shared an opinion, she corrected the wording, as if clarifying for the room. If I declined something, she joked about me being low-key or not ambitious like the rest of us. Always smiling, always casual, always delivered with a tone that made it seem ungracious to object. And every time the room followed her lead. People laughed. Conversations moved on. Plates were passed. Nothing stopped long enough for me to say, actually, that's not true. So I didn't. Instead, I started adjusting. I spoke less about myself. I redirected attention back to others. I edited my stories mid-sentence, trimming away anything that might invite commentary. I learned which subjects Claire lost interest in quickly, and I steered toward those. This wasn't submission, not consciously. It felt like diplomacy, like choosing efficiency over friction. Mark noticed none of this. Or maybe that's not entirely fair. He noticed, but not in a way that registered as a problem. To him, family gatherings were noisy but loving. Claire was just intense. I was great at handling people. That phrase came up once, in the car on the way home. "You're so good at handling my family," he said casually. "I don't know how you stay so calm." I smiled and looked out the window. Handling, as if they were something to manage rather than engage with. As if my quiet wasn't a response to pressure, but a natural state. And I let that definition stand. The truth was, I had begun to normalize the discomfort. I told myself this was what being the outsider looked like. That family systems took time. That respect would come if I didn't force it. I believed that if I stayed kind, consistent, and unreactive, the dynamic would eventually soften. What I didn't realize was that by not reacting, I was teaching them what they could do. Disrespect, when unchallenged, doesn't disappear. It settles. It becomes background noise. It gets folded into how things are. The most unsettling part was how quickly I adapted. I laughed along when I shouldn't have. I answered questions that had assumptions baked into them. I filled the silences meant to expose awkwardness. I became fluent in minimizing myself. And no one asked me to stop. Not Claire, not Mark, not anyone. There's a strange loneliness in being praised for your tolerance while it erodes you. In being seen as strong because you endure, not because you're protected. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't plotting anything. I was still hoping, quietly, that awareness would dawn on its own. That someone would notice. That Mark would step in. That Claire would eventually respect the boundary I never stated. Instead, the pattern solidified. And once a pattern becomes familiar, it stops feeling wrong to everyone except the person living inside it. By the time I realized that, the silence I'd chosen had already begun to define me. Roles in families are rarely announced. No one gathers you into a room and explains where you stand. They're assigned quietly, through repetition, through what's allowed and what's ignored. By the time I noticed mine, it was already well established. I was the reliable one. The extra chair, the extra set of hands. The person who remembered to bring dessert, who helped in the kitchen without being asked, who stayed late to help clean up, while conversations moved back to the living room. If something needed doing, it somehow drifted toward me, not because anyone demanded it, but because I accepted it without protest. Claire was the authority. Their parents were the foundation. Mark was the bridge, and I was the support structure no one thought about unless it wobbled. What struck me most was how invisible the role felt once it was set. People spoke around me, not to me. Decisions were discussed in front of me, not with me. My presence was assumed, my input optional. If I declined to help, there was surprise, not anger, just confusion, as if I'd briefly stepped out of character. I remember one moment clearly. We were preparing for a family gathering, and Mark's mother was listing out tasks: cooking, setting the table, and picking up drinks. She looked at me instinctively when she mentioned desserts. "Mary usually handles that," she said, not unkindly. Just factual. I smiled and nodded. Mark didn't look up. No one asked if I wanted to. It wasn't a request anymore. It was an expectation. That's when it fully registered, not as resentment, but as clarity, that I had been categorized. Useful, low friction, unlikely to push back. I had become safe to overlook. And here's the uncomfortable truth. I helped build that version of myself. Every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace. Every time I smoothed over a comment instead of addressing it. Every time I told myself it wasn't worth it. I believed I was choosing maturity, but I was also teaching people how to treat me. What hurt wasn't the work or the tasks. I didn't mind contributing. I minded that my value was measured by what I provided, not who I was. And still, I didn't confront anyone, because confronting would have meant explaining something they didn't think existed. It would have meant breaking the image of the agreeable, adaptable wife. It would have meant asking Mark, out loud, why he was comfortable letting me be diminished. I wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, I observed. I noticed how Claire's words shaped the room, how quickly people aligned with her framing, how Mark deferred to her in subtle ways, even when he disagreed privately. And I noticed something else too. No one was malicious. That was the hardest part to reconcile. They weren't trying to hurt me. They simply weren't considering me. And when people aren't forced to consider you, they rarely start on their own. The role I was assigned wasn't cruel, but it was limiting. It required me to stay small, to remain acceptable. I could feel the edges of myself pressing against it, quietly, patiently, and somewhere in that pressure something began to strain. The shift didn't come with a confrontation. It didn't arrive as anger. It didn't even look like a decision. It came as a moment of stillness. It was an ordinary afternoon, days before Thanksgiving. Mark and I were in the kitchen going over plans, who we were seeing, what time we needed to leave, what dishes we'd bring, the logistics of togetherness. He was relaxed, leaning against the counter, scrolling through messages from his sister. "Claire says we should get there earlier this year," he said. "She wants to do a full sit-down." I nodded, listening. "And she thinks you should bring something lighter," he added. "Not your usual thing. She said Thanksgiving food is already heavy." He said it casually, not as an order, not as criticism, just relaying information. Something in me paused, not because of what he said, but because of how naturally he passed it along. No question, no buffer, no awareness that he was transmitting his sister's preferences directly into my space, as if they outranked my own. I felt that familiar impulse rise, the one that says, don't make this bigger than it is, the one that says, just adjust. But this time I didn't respond right away. I looked at him, really looked. He was kind. He loved me. He had never raised his voice at me. He believed, genuinely, that there was no problem here. And that was the moment. The realization wasn't that they're disrespecting me. I've been managing this alone. I saw with sudden clarity that my silence had been doing more than preserving peace. It had been insulating everyone else from responsibility. As long as I absorbed the discomfort quietly, no one else had to notice it. Not Claire, not his parents, and not Mark. I felt oddly calm, not resigned, aware. I said evenly, I'll bring what I think is appropriate. He blinked just once. Oh, okay, he said. I was just passing it along. I know, I replied. And that was it. No argument, no tension. The conversation moved on. But inside me, something had aligned. For the first time, I stopped framing my experience as a misunderstanding or a personality clash. I stopped waiting for someone else to validate what I felt. I understood that nothing would change unless I changed how I participated. Not by becoming louder, not by confronting everyone at once, but by becoming deliberate. I didn't need to announce my boundaries. I needed to stop betraying them. That night, lying in bed, I replayed past moments, not with bitterness, but with precision. I saw patterns instead of isolated incidents. I saw how predictably my quietness had been interpreted, and I saw something else too. I wasn't powerless. I had choices I hadn't considered because I'd been too busy being agreeable. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but it was irreversible. From that moment on, my silence would no longer be automatic. It would be intentional. After that afternoon, nothing on the surface changed. I still attended family dinners. I still smiled, listened, and participated. I didn't suddenly assert myself or demand space. But internally, the posture was different. Before, my silence had been reflexive, a way to keep things smooth. Now it has become selective. I started noticing when I spoke and why. I paid attention to what happened when I didn't fill the gaps, and something interesting emerged. People are deeply uncomfortable with unfilled space. When Claire made a comment that subtly minimized me, and I didn't laugh, the room felt it. Not enough to cause conflict, but enough to register. When I didn't rush to agree, conversation stalled for half a second longer than usual. When I didn't explain myself, assumptions sat exposed. I wasn't withholding warmth. I was withholding permission. Mark noticed this before anyone else. "You've been quieter lately," he said one evening, not accusatory, curious. I met his gaze calmly. "I don't think so." He shrugged. "Maybe I'm imagining it." Maybe. At family gatherings, Claire began to watch me more closely. Her jokes didn't land as smoothly when there was no immediate response. She adjusted her tone, tried a different angle. I didn't correct her. I didn't challenge her. I simply stopped cushioning her words. And that absence spoke louder than confrontation ever could. What they mistook for weakness had always been discipline. What they mistook for passivity was restraint. Now that the restraint had direction, I also stopped volunteering. If someone asked, I helped. If they assumed, I let the assumption sit unanswered. The first few times someone else stepped in awkwardly. The dynamic wobbled. No one commented on it, but everyone noticed. The silence worked because it forced awareness without accusation, and yet they still underestimated it. They assumed I was tired, or distracted, or going through something personal. They believed, as people often do, that if there were a real problem, I would say something. They didn't realize that I had, just not in the way they expected. In quiet systems, disruption doesn't need to be loud to be effective. It only needs to be consistent, and consistency is something I was very good at. While everything looked the same on the outside, something else was happening quietly, methodically, in the background. I was paying attention in a way I hadn't before, not to collect grievances, but to understand structure. I started noticing who deferred to whom, who spoke first, who adjusted plans, and who never did. I watched how information moved through the family, who controlled it, who filtered it, and who was expected to adapt to it without question. And I noticed how often Mark acted as a buffer for everyone except me. He translated his sister's preferences. He softened his parents' expectations. He absorbed tension, so gatherings stayed pleasant. What he didn't do was question why I was always the one adjusting. That awareness didn't make me angry. It made me strategic. I also began documenting, not in a dramatic sense. No secret recordings or anything like that. Just clarity. I kept notes after gatherings, short factual observations. Who made decisions? Who dismissed what? Who stayed silent when lines were crossed? Patterns are hard to argue with when they're written down. At the same time, I started reclaiming parts of myself I compressed to fit the role I was given. I invested more deeply in my work, not to prove anything, but because it grounded me. I rebuilt professional connections I'd let fade. I updated things I'd postponed under the excuse of being low priority. I also became very careful with my energy. I stopped explaining myself to people who weren't listening. I stopped over-functioning to preempt discomfort. I stopped translating my intentions into something more palatable. None of this announced itself. That's why no one noticed. To them, I was still Mary, calm, composed, agreeable, still present, still polite, still helpful when asked. What they didn't see was that I was repositioning internally. I was making sure that my sense of self no longer depended on how smoothly the room ran. And in doing that, I quietly removed the leverage they'd never realized they had. I wasn't withdrawing. I wasn't plotting. I was preparing, not for revenge, but for clarity. Because once you see the system clearly, you stop taking things personally. You stop reacting emotionally. You start choosing. And choice is where power actually lives. They never noticed that my silence had changed, because it looked exactly like the silence they'd always known. They assumed it meant nothing. They were wrong. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. There was no gasp, no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory. It arrived quietly, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for me to be ready to see it. One evening, after another family gathering, I sat alone in the living room, while Mark took a call from his sister in the other room. I wasn't listening intentionally, but when you've lived inside a dynamic long enough, you recognize its patterns without trying. His tone shifted, not dramatically, just slightly deferential, more careful, more accommodating. "I get it," he said. "Yeah, that makes sense. We'll adjust." When he came back, he summarized the call the way he always did. Efficiently, neutrally, as if passing along logistics rather than expectations. And suddenly I saw it. The leverage wasn't something Claire had over me. It was something she had over him. Mark had spent his whole life maintaining equilibrium in his family. He was the one who smoothed things over, kept everyone comfortable, and prevented friction before it became visible. That role had shaped him long before I entered the picture, and I had unknowingly stepped into a supporting role within that structure. Claire didn't need to dominate me directly. She only needed to set the tone. Mark would handle the rest, filtering, translating, asking me to adapt so she didn't have to. That was the system, and the realization that followed was even quieter, even more unsettling. If I stepped out of my role, the system wouldn't know how to compensate. Not immediately, not gracefully. There was no replacement for the function I'd been serving. That wasn't arrogance, it was an observation. I wasn't just easygoing. I was absorbing friction no one else wanted to handle. And I had been doing it so well that no one had questioned whether it was fair. That night, I didn't confront Mark. I didn't bring up Claire. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I didn't need to, because clarity doesn't require an audience. I understood then that my power wasn't in calling out the disrespect. It was in no longer neutralizing its consequences. And that understanding was sobering, not empowering. It meant that if I changed how I participated, others would feel it. Not as punishment, but as absence. The reveal wasn't about leverage over them. It was about leverage within myself. I could keep the system running, or I could step back and let it show its cracks. And once you see that choice clearly, you can't unsee it. Once you see the structure clearly, you reach a moment where inaction becomes its own decision. That was where I stood. I had options, real ones, not imagined. I could finally confront Claire directly. Call out the comments, name the pattern, demand respect. It would be dramatic, cathartic maybe, but it would also place me neatly into a role I didn't want. The sensitive one, the disruptor, the problem that needed managing. I could confront Mark, ask him explicitly why he never spoke up. Why does he let things slide? Why was my comfort always secondary to his family's ease? That conversation would be quieter, but heavier. It would require him to see himself differently, and I wasn't sure he was ready. Or I could do what I had been doing all along. Stay silent, stay adaptable, stay useful, and accept that this was the cost of peace. Each option had a price. And then there was a fourth option, the one that didn't involve convincing anyone of anything. I could change my participation without announcing it, not to punish, not to teach a lesson, but to stop offering myself as the solution to a problem I didn't create. That option felt irreversible, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. It meant accepting that people might feel confused, disappointed, even hurt. It meant letting go of the need to be understood immediately. It meant trusting that clarity would emerge on its own timeline. Most importantly, it meant respecting myself enough to stop waiting for permission. I thought about Thanksgiving, the long table, the noise, the moment that would inevitably come, the subtle insult, the offhand dismissal, the silence that followed. I realized something then. The pain of being overlooked had always been compounded by the hope that this time would be different. I decided to remove that hope. Not in a bitter way, in a grounded one. Hope misplaced had kept me compliant. So I chose the option that required the least explanation and the most integrity. I chose to step back. Not emotionally, but structurally. I wouldn't confront yet. I wouldn't announce boundaries. I would simply stop absorbing what wasn't mine. That decision didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet, heavy, clean. And once it was made, I didn't feel the urge to revisit it. Some decisions, once aligned, don't need reinforcement. They just need follow-through. After the decision, my life didn't change overnight. That was intentional. I moved carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for the gravity of what I was doing. Quiet shifts are most effective when they're allowed to settle before they're noticed. I started with logistics. I separated certain responsibilities that had always been assumed to be shared, not dramatically, just cleanly. I redirected my time and energy toward commitments that were explicitly mine, not inherited through marriage. I became more precise with my calendar. When family gatherings were planned, I didn't rearrange my work schedule automatically. If I could attend, I did. If I couldn't, I didn't over-explain. Mark noticed this first. "You don't have to make everything work around them," he said once gently. "I know," I replied, and I let that be the end of it. I also stopped being the messenger. When Mark relayed his sister's preferences or concerns, I listened, but I didn't adjust preemptively. I made choices based on my own judgment. If they aligned, fine. If they didn't, I didn't rush to smooth the edges. At Thanksgiving, I brought the dish I wanted to bring. Claire commented on it, lightly. I smiled, thanked her for hosting, and took my seat. No explanation, no apology. The silence that followed wasn't tense, but it was noticeable. Behind the scenes, I made other adjustments. I reviewed our financial arrangements, not because there was anything wrong, but because clarity matters. I ensured I had full visibility and autonomy where it was appropriate. I updated documents that hadn't been revisited in years, not in secret, just without commentary. I also invested more time in relationships where my presence wasn't conditional. Friends who asked questions, colleagues who listened, spaces where I didn't have to earn my seat by being agreeable. None of this looked like rebellion. That's why no one noticed. Yet, to them I was still present, still calm, still reasonable. But I was no longer compensating for the imbalance. An imbalance, once unsupported, begins to show itself. The consequences didn't announce themselves. They crept in with discomfort, small delays, awkward pauses, moments where someone expected me to step in, and I didn't. At the next family gathering, the kitchen felt different. Tasks were discussed out loud instead of being assumed. Someone forgot to bring something. The timing was off. Nothing went wrong, but nothing flowed effortlessly either. Claire grew sharper, not cruel, just less polished. Her jokes missed their rhythm. She repeated herself more. She looked around the table as if waiting for something that wasn't coming. Mark noticed this too. "They seem stressed," he said afterward. "I don't know why." I did. Without me absorbing friction, it had nowhere to go. Plans that had once just worked now required negotiation. Expectations that had been quietly met were suddenly visible. And visibility has a way of making people uneasy. Still, no one confronted me, because there was nothing to confront. I hadn't refused. I hadn't accused. I hadn't changed my tone. I had simply stopped overfunctioning. The discomfort wasn't punishment, it was recalibration. And recalibration is always uncomfortable at first. I watched as Mark became more involved, fielding questions, making decisions, smoothing things over. The role he'd subconsciously assigned to me had begun to slide back toward him. He didn't complain, but I could see the effort. The consequences were subtle, but they were cumulative, and once they began, there was no clean way to reverse them without returning to the old pattern, which I wasn't willing to do. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, they couldn't quite name what it was. That's the thing about systems. You don't miss the part that's working until it stops. The tension didn't show up as anger. It showed up as confusion. Plans were suddenly debated instead of assumed. Small misunderstandings stacked on top of each other. People spoke more carefully, then more defensively. The easy rhythm Mark's family prided themselves on felt off. Claire was the first to feel it deeply. She began reaching out more. Texts about logistics, suggestions framed as questions instead of directives. Her tone softened, then sharpened again when the results weren't what she expected. "What's going on with Mary?" she asked Mark once, not unkindly, just puzzled. He didn't have an answer. That's when the panic began, not loud but internal, because if something had changed, no one knew when, or why, or how to undo it. Mark grew quieter at home, more preoccupied. He started double-checking things I used to handle instinctively. He caught himself mid-sentence more than once, realizing he was about to pass something along that maybe shouldn't be passed anymore. One evening he said, "If I did something wrong, you'd tell me, right?" I looked at him, really looked. "Yes," I said calmly, "I would." And I meant it. But what he didn't understand yet was that not everything broken announces itself as wrongdoing. Some things simply reach their limit. By the time he noticed the absence of my quiet labor, it was already too late to restore it without addressing why it had existed in the first place. And that conversation about roles, silence, protection couldn't be rushed or patched over. It required something none of them had prepared for: accountability. The system wanted the old balance back, but the cost of that balance had finally become visible. And once a cost is visible, it can't be unseen. By the time anyone openly sensed that something was wrong, the discomfort had already settled too deeply to be traced back to a single cause. That's the danger of systems built on quiet labor. They don't break suddenly. They deteriorate gradually, invisibly, until the absence becomes undeniable, but unexplainable. At first, Mark's family described it as stress, then as bad timing, then as everyone is on edge lately. No one said my name, and yet everything pointed to the space I no longer filled. Family gatherings became strangely procedural. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now required clarification. Decisions that had previously been made with a glance in my direction now stalled, waiting for someone to step in. And no one did. The kitchen, once my unspoken territory, became neutral ground. People hovered instead of moving. Tasks were half started, then abandoned. Someone would ask, Should we do this now? And the question would float unanswered for a moment longer than comfort allowed. It wasn't chaos, it was inefficiency. And inefficiency unsettles people who are used to emotional ease. Claire felt it most acutely. Her authority had always relied on an invisible support system, one that ensured her preferences didn't create friction. Without realizing it, she had grown accustomed to speaking decisively and having the details resolved elsewhere. Now they weren't. She began checking in more frequently. Texts arrived framed as a collaboration. What do you think about? Do you mind if we? Just wanted to get your input. At first I responded politely, briefly, without urgency. Then gradually I stopped responding as quickly, not to make a point, but because I no longer treated her priorities as inherently more important than my own. That delay, mere hours sometimes, created visible tension. Plans became provisional. Claire followed up. Mark stepped in to mediate. And that's when the strain shifted direction. Mark was used to mediating conflict between people, not compensating for absence. He had always relied on my steadiness as a given, not a variable. Now, he found himself carrying weight he hadn't acknowledged before. He became more tired, less present. At home, he moved through routines cautiously, as if unsure where the ground had shifted. He asked more questions. He hesitated before making assumptions. And slowly, quietly, panic crept in. Not because he thought I was angry, but because he realized he no longer knew where the boundaries were. One night, after a particularly awkward dinner where no one could agree on timing or responsibilities, he said almost to himself, "I don't understand why everything feels harder." I didn't answer, not because I didn't care, but because the answer wasn't something I could hand him without undoing everything I had done to protect myself. The truth was, it was harder now, because the ease had been subsidized, and the subsidy had ended. Claire, meanwhile, began oscillating between charm and irritation. When charm didn't restore the old rhythm, irritation surfaced, not directed at me, but at the situation. She snapped at her parents. She corrected Mark more sharply. Her jokes became brittle. She was losing control of a system she had never fully seen, and that loss confused her. "Mary's been distant," she told Mark during one phone call I overheard unintentionally. Did I do something? The question wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely unsettled. Mark didn't know how to answer, because to answer would have required him to acknowledge something he'd spent years avoiding, that my silence had not been neutrality. It had been labor. At home, he began circling the issue cautiously. "If something's bothering you, I want to know," he said one evening, voice careful. "I feel like I might have missed something." I looked at him then, not with resentment, not with triumph, but with a kind of steady sadness. "Yes," I said gently, "you did." The pause that followed was long, too long to be patched over, too short to contain everything that needed to be said. He waited. I didn't continue, because the moment for easy repair had passed. What he was asking for now wasn't clarification. It was a restoration, and restoration without reckoning is just repetition. Over the following weeks, the family attempted to recalibrate without addressing the core issue. Schedules were adjusted, responsibilities were reassigned, expectations were spoken aloud instead of assumed, but something essential was missing. Trust, not because I'd broken it, but because they realized it had been one-sided. They had trusted me to carry emotional weight indefinitely. I had trusted them to notice when it became too heavy. Neither expectation had been fulfilled. And now, the system was asking to be fixed without being examined. That's when it became truly too late, because once you see that your peace was built on your own erasure, you cannot unsee it, and you cannot restore what required you to disappear. Mark felt this realization last. He began to understand that asking me to go back to how things were would mean asking me to accept less than I now knew I deserved, and he couldn't bring himself to say that out loud. So instead he said nothing, just as he had before. Only this time the silence wasn't mine alone. It sat between us, heavy, unavoidable, demanding something deeper than adjustment, something irreversible. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, No list of grievances was laid out like evidence. It happened on a quiet evening, after dinner, when the house was still, and there was nowhere for the conversation to hide. Mark sat across from me, his posture careful, as if he were approaching something fragile. "I think I owe you an apology," he said. I didn't rush to respond. Not because I was withholding forgiveness, but because I wanted to be precise. "For what?" I asked calmly. He exhaled slowly. "For not protecting you. For assuming you were fine because you never complained." There it was. Not denial, not defensiveness, recognition. "I didn't know how to step in," he continued, "and I didn't realize my silence was choosing a side." I nodded. "I know." That seemed to surprise him more than anger would have. "I should have said something," he added, "especially that night, Thanksgiving. My husband let his sister insult me during Thanksgiving dinner. He never said a word. Saying it out loud didn't sting the way it once had. It felt factual now, settled. "I wasn't waiting for you to fight with her," I said. "I was waiting for you to acknowledge me." The room stayed quiet. "I thought staying out of it was neutral," he said. "It never is," I replied gently. Silence always supports the louder voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. "What do you need now?" I considered that carefully. "I need you to stop managing me," I said, "and start standing with me." He nodded once. No promises, no overcorrection, just understanding. There was no emotional explosion because there didn't need to be one. The power had already shifted, not through words but through absence. And this conversation wasn't about undoing the past. It was about deciding whether the future would repeat itself. When people ask who I am now, they usually mean what changed. They expect a dramatic answer, a sharper edge, a colder version of me. Sometimes they expect bitterness or distance, or a kind of emotional armor that replaces softness with strength. What they don't expect is this. I'm still myself. I didn't harden. I didn't retreat. I didn't become louder or more aggressive or less kind. What changed wasn't my personality. It was my posture. I no longer enter rooms prepared to adapt before I'm even asked. I no longer scan faces automatically, measuring who needs comfort, who needs smoothing, who might be upset if I don't step in. That reflex is gone. Not because I don't care, but because I've learned the difference between care and self-erasure. I still speak thoughtfully. I still pause before responding. I still value listening over dominating conversations. But now, when I speak, I don't rush to soften the impact of my own words. I let them land as they are. And when I don't speak, it's no longer because I'm bracing myself to absorb something. It's because I don't need to. In Mark's family, I occupy a different space now. Not a louder one, not a more central one, but a clearer one. I'm no longer assumed. I'm acknowledged. If I help, it's requested. If I decline, it's accepted. If a comment crosses a line, it doesn't float unanswered. Sometimes Mark responds before I do. Sometimes I respond myself. Briefly, calmly, without explanation. And sometimes the moment passes without response at all. But the difference is this. The silence no longer belongs to me alone. There's an awareness now, a pause, a recognition that my quiet isn't a blank space to be filled by someone else's voice. Claire, interestingly, has changed too. She's still confident, still direct, still herself. But she's more careful with me, not out of fear, but respect. She watches for my reactions now. She waits instead of assuming, not because I demanded it, because the dynamic that once supported her unchecked authority no longer exists. And that's something I want to be honest about. It wasn't my goal to change her, or anyone. My goal was simply to stop disappearing. The most profound shift has been internal. I trust my perceptions now without immediately interrogating them. When something feels off, I don't ask myself whether I'm being sensitive. I ask whether something crossed my values. I don't need a consensus to feel certain. I don't need witnesses to feel validated. I don't need to rehearse my pain to make it understandable. That alone has changed how I move through the world. At work, I'm clearer. I don't over-explain my decisions. I don't apologize for having boundaries disguised as schedules. I take up the space my role requires, no more, no less. In friendships, I no longer maintain connections through effort alone. If something feels one-sided, I notice it, and I respond accordingly, not with confrontation, but with calibration. And in my marriage, something essential has shifted. Mark doesn't manage me anymore. He doesn't translate me. He doesn't assume my silence means agreement. He asks. He listens. And when he misses something, as people do, he notices sooner. Not because I changed him, because I stopped compensating. Who I am now isn't someone new. She's the version of me that existed all along, but was quieted by habit, expectation, and misplaced patience. I'm still calm, still composed, still reflective, but I'm no longer absorbent. I don't carry what isn't mine. I don't smooth what needs to be seen. I don't disappear to preserve comfort, and that, more than any confrontation, has redefined my identity. Not as someone difficult, not as someone fragile, but as someone solid enough to remain herself without explanation. Stories like this are often framed as turning points, before and after, wrong and right, silence and voice. But the truth is quieter than that. Nothing in my life splits cleanly down the middle. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense and stayed that way. What changed wasn't the world around me. It was the agreement I had with myself. For a long time, I believed that being good meant being accommodating, that being loved meant being easy, that maturity meant swallowing discomfort so others wouldn't have to feel it. What I learned is this: when you consistently absorb what should be shared, people don't see your strength. They depend on your disappearance. And they rarely do it on purpose. No one sat me down and decided I would be overlooked. No one planned for my voice to matter less. The dynamic formed because it worked for everyone except me. That's why this story isn't about blame. It's about responsibility. There is a quiet responsibility we all have. To notice when our calm is being used as a cushion, when our silence is being mistaken for consent, when our patience is being treated as infinite. And there is an even quieter responsibility to ourselves to stop participating in dynamics that require us to shrink. What changed everything wasn't confrontation. It was a refusal. Refusing to over-explain. Refusing to over-function. Refusing to make myself smaller so others could stay comfortable. That kind of refusal doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't earn applause. Often it's misunderstood at first, but it does something powerful. It forces clarity. When you step out of a role that depends on your self-erasure, the system has to respond. People either adjust or they reveal what they were truly attached to. And either way, you learn the truth. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this: you don't owe anyone endless tolerance just because you're capable of it. You don't have to prove that something hurts before it deserves respect. And you don't need to raise your voice to reclaim your place. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about alignment with yourself. It's about standing still long enough that your absence of compliance becomes visible. It's about letting discomfort exist without rushing to fix it. It's about trusting that your worth doesn't need constant translation. If you've ever been the one who handles things, who smooths over tension, who stays silent so others don't have to adjust, this is your reminder. You are not difficult to consider. You are not sensitive to noticing patterns. And you are not wrong for stepping back when something costs too much. Before we end, I want to leave you with one open question, and I genuinely invite you to answer it in the comments. Have you ever realized that the moment you stopped overfunctioning was the moment others were finally forced to see you clearly? Thank you for listening.